The next speaker has been described by The Observer as Britain's most respected green energy boss. Throughout the 80s, he worked as a geologist in the oil industry. In the 90s, he left to become an environmental campaigner for Greenpeace. The past decades, he's written several books arguing to invest green and keep fossil energy in the ground. He started the world's first private equity fund for renewable energy. And he's founded one of UK's largest independent solar electric companies. Please give a warm applause to founder and chairman of Solar Century, Jeremy Legget.
So you're all here today because either you are climate campaigners in your different sorts of ways, or you're interested in becoming such, or you might become such, given that you're interested enough in climate change to come to this wonderful conference. So I thought the most useful thing I could do is tell two stories about climate campaigning things that I've been involved with that might be in danger of working. Now, I've worked on climate, as you heard, for a quarter of a century, and I should say, by way of introduction, that almost everything I've done, like almost everything anybody has done working on climate change for a quarter of a century, just hasn't worked. I've had more than my share of disasters and disappointments. But the two things I want to tell you about are very exciting to me and the people that I work with, and they come at opposite ends of the spectrum. So the first story is about work in the capital markets and how carbon fuels are financed, how basically money flows into this suicidally dysfunctional machine that we have that keeps pumping up emissions into our thin and fragile atmosphere. And the second story is about the other end of the spectrum, right down to how you can knock out fossil fuels at the level of individual solar lights in Africa, and some work that I've been involved with in that respect. So let me start with Carbon Tracker, the carbon bubble. I'm privileged to be the chairman of a small think tank in the City of London of financial analysts, most of whom come from within the financial sector. One comes from WWF, actually, originally. And a few years ago, we got together around the idea that what was desperately needed was an analysis of where carbon sits within companies and on stock exchanges. And this we were going to calculate and write a report on and try and get the regulators and all the pieces of the financial chain, all the actors across the financial chain, to move away from this really dysfunctional situation that I'm sure you all appreciate exists in the capital markets, whereby it's as though you have two planets. On one planet, all the well-meaning politicians and most of the politicians who go to the climate negotiations do want to do something about it. And they've been trying for years. So they try, and some of them, make promises. Some of them even turn their promises into laws, as has happened in my own country, the UK, with our Climate Act. But on the other planet are all these players in the capital markets who are allowed to go on building reserves of oil, coal, and gas and turn resources into reserves and count them as assets on their balance sheets as though they're at precisely zero risk of ever being impaired over long periods of time into the future. So they're taking a huge bet that A, policymakers will do nothing about climate change, and B, that the risk that policymakers might do something about climate change will actually one day be recognized and written into the rule books of the capital markets. So we did this exercise, and the results I think many of you will be familiar with. Basically, if we want to keep our global warming below 2 degrees Celsius with a reasonable chance of doing that, we can only afford to burn about 20% of the fossil fuels that exist in proved reserves today. 80% of it is essentially, in inverted commas, unburnable and at minimum at risk of being stranded at some level. So we produced our report. We analyzed the top 200 oil, gas, and coal companies. You sort of think to yourself, why had nobody done this actually before? We'd gone from the World Climate Conference in 1990 to 2010, and to our knowledge it had never been done. If it was done in companies, it was never published. And so this first report had an interesting impact. It was covered 6 times in the Financial Times. And across the financial sector, the segments of the financial chain, there were interesting reactions to it. My favorite was from the actuaries, the little-known body of people that's so important in insurance and valuation, that actually talks about the value of things, calculates the value of things, and the actuary is their professional journal. And an editorial in the actuary said, read this report, colleagues, because if these people are even halfway right, we as an entire profession have been guilty of gross negligence for many years in our valuation. So you could see, armed with this, we were very excited and keen to go to all the other players and say, what are you going to do about it? So we went to the Bank of England, talked to the regulator. Why don't you require that the risk is recognized and cited in financial documentation, for example? It's ridiculous that a coal company can come to the City of London, do an initial public offering, and write a 600-word prospectus that doesn't even mention climate change. How is that possible in 2010? And the Bank of England said, well, you know, maybe you've got a point. Why don't you go and talk to the ratings agencies? So we talked to the ratings agencies, and they said, well, you know, really this is the responsibility of the accountants. Go to talk to the big 5, and they should insist that all this stuff is written into annual accounts of companies. Anyway, so it went on. Nobody sat us down and said, look, guys, you're out of order here. We price in the risk. There's nothing to worry about. We apply discount rates, yada, yada, yada. Nothing like that. So then we thought, okay, let's have a go at the second report, and this time we look at CapEx. We look at where the money actually goes into taking the resources, turning them into reserves, and how much that money is, company by company. And the total was a surprise. It was $670 billion in the year before we published the report. This came out in May this year. We launched it at the headquarters of Bloomberg to a packed audience from the city. $670 billion. So as Bill McKibben and I described it in an op-ed, this is essentially, over a 10-year period, a $6 trillion bet that politicians and policymakers will never do anything, not even the first thing, about climate change. And that's ridiculous and indeed insulting to politicians around the world. So the other issue is how much of the money from the enormous profitability that comes back from the development of these reserves goes to the investors, the asset owners, as dividends. And this, of course, includes you. It includes all of us, the people who have their pensions invested. And the figure in that year was about $160 billion. So it's much lower than the amount that's going into CapEx. And our case was, you know, there's just too much money being invested and risked in a world where you can't burn more than 20% of the reserves you have. And over 10 years, you are going to spend $6,000 billion developing more. This is nuts. This is suicidal behavior, institutionalized suicidal behavior. So this report really did hit some targets. I felt at the actual launch for the first time a massive shiver of excitement that I had to try and suppress because there was a little panel of financial experts who, you know, reacted to the report. One of them was the lead oil and gas analyst at HSBC. I'd never met this gentleman before, Paul Spedding, and you can see this on YouTube. What he says is you can't fault this exercise and the numbers in it. And in fact, when you combine that with the existing profitability of the oil and gas industry around the world, you know their profits have been falling of late for all sorts of reasons. What I conclude, and what I should be telling the bank's clients, is that this capex should not be invested in further development of reserves. It should be given back to investors as dividends so that we can invest it in things that we think might be more profitable. And at that moment, you sort of think, crikey, if all the oil and gas analysts in all the investment banks start talking like this fellow, this is an industry whose days are numbered, and it's going to have to find another way to do business. And of course, this is what we want as climate campaigners. We want these people to become energy companies and to stop the behavior that is keeping us on a road to 6 degrees. So I'm not going to recite what happened after that. I think many of you will know part of it, but if you don't, just have a look at the Carbon Tracker website. You can see the list. We keep a log of all the things that have happened. The Wall Street Journal, of all papers, has written the carbon bubble has become part of the mainstream. And you may have seen Al Gore and David Blood had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the carbon bubble just last week. Now you notice in about the last 7 or 8 minutes of my discourse, the word climate has not appeared once. You've heard a lot of financial jargon, and this is why the idea is interesting, because we're engaging this sector using the language of the capital markets and not the language that we're used to mostly as climate campaigners. That's not to say it shouldn't be done. And of course, in parallel, there's this wonderful campaign in favor of divestment being run by 350.org, and many student activists are involved in this, and they are continuing to make the ethical and moral case, and must, because that is a very valid case. But the Carbon Tracker work is in parallel with that, not talking about ethics and morality, just talking about wasting your assets and using the words of the capital market. So it's very exciting, and it plugs right into the discourse here in Norway about the future of your vast state pension fund, one of the biggest of the world's sovereign wealth funds. And you can imagine the excitement that many of us, I'm sure everyone here has heard, just the news from yesterday, that there may be a majority in politics in this country in favor of getting out of coal completely in that fund and looking at oil and gas as well. And that would be a magnificent national contribution in a vital time, because what's happening in the year ahead is that there are going to be a series of very, very important meetings. The first really decisive one will be the Global Leaders Meeting in November next year at the United Nations. At that meeting, the leaders must commit to a meaningful outcome from the Paris Climate Summit, the all-important one in December 2015. And in the run-up to that, all of us in our different ways need to figure out how we can strengthen the arm of the negotiators. That thing from Norway and a parallel development from Sweden would be wonderful contributions, and we'll leave that thought there. And so, let me move to the second story, which is completely different, and it's a microcosm of what we could do if we started taking money away from fossil fuels and putting them into clean energy. It's not that clean energy is doing too badly as it stands. I mean, $250 billion were invested last year, almost as much in earlier years. And as a result of that, we're seeing wind and solar in Europe, for example, being deployed every year in greater volumes than fossil fuels and nuclear combined. So we're doing okay, but we need to do better, as we heard from Marius this morning. If we just keep going with these growth rates, we can achieve amazing things. And people like me have no doubt that with renewables, we can power modern economies 100% without using fossil fuels if we're given the chance. And so, as a direct action, as a climate campaigner, 13 years ago, I set up a solar company. It's called Solar Century. It's a medium-sized downstream solar company, for those of you who know the jargon. It's profitable, about $100 million company now, and it's grown at between 40% in early on and 30% over the last 5 years. So, you know, in terms of a business success story, it's kind of okay. It's not okay for our venture capital backers. Like many solar companies, we've struggled to achieve that kind of hockey stick growth that they were looking for and experienced in the digital revolution and the internet revolution. But then most all renewable companies have struggled. And the reason we've struggled is the incumbency and the barriers that it puts up for us. The primary reason comes from this pushback from the incumbency. Anyway, that's not the story I want to tell you. It's just the parent of the story I want to tell you, because I wrote into the founding articles of that company a clause that said, we will give 5% of our profits every year to a charity that will try to solarize Africa. And every time I negotiated with venture capitalists, which was 4 times, efforts were made to get rid of that clause. But we said, we'll negotiate on many things, but not that. That's non-negotiable. So now this company is locked into giving 5% of its profits. And we created a charity called Solar Aid. And Solar Aid itself created a retail brand called Sunny Money, which operates in the field and sells solar lanterns. Aid is the wrong word for what we do. It's self-help. Of course, we run a very different model from the venture capital-backed one. All our profits are recycled endlessly back into growing the machine. And so we go off into the field, we sell solar lanterns, we're trying to knock out kerosene, and this is the microcosm. So just as the mothership company can compete with diesel on equal terms and knock out diesel generators and replace them with cheaper solar, and in multiple markets we're going to be able to do that in a few years' time in the developed world too. So Sunny Money is selling lanterns that knock out kerosene, and the good that comes from that is just a cascading flow of things. It starts with the money saved. So it's amazing to think that a little solar lantern can save an average household in Kenya, we know this from field research, up to 40% of its annual income. 40%, one lantern. That's then spent on seeds, medicines, school books, etc., etc. So in the last 3 years, Sunny Money has become the #1 retailer of solar lighting in Africa. I'm proud to say, and I can boast about this a bit because it's the boys and girls based in Nairobi in the field that have done this. We've done it in only 4 African countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. There are 54 countries in Africa, and yet the World Bank tell us that we're the #1 retailer with 25% of the market share. Entity that's second in market share is Total, the oil company. And so this is a wonderful story with benefits that are huge. And if you just look at one thing to see what I'm talking about on the website or on YouTube, I would say just Google Newsnight, which is a BBC flagship news and current affairs program, Newsnight Solar Aid, YouTube. And up will come this film. It's a couple of minutes long, and it's about a boy way out in the backwoods in Kenya who came very near the top nationally in his exams. He's about 15, 16 years old. And, you know, how is that possible? You know, just in a remote village in Kenya. So he was asked by the Newsnight team, like, to send a camera there. And he pointed at his solar lantern, and he said, this is 4 hours of extra homework every night, this lantern. That's how I did it. And then they asked him, what do you want to do with all these qualifications you're getting, all these exams you're passing? He says, I want to become a doctor. So this is very, very good work to be involved in, and it's massively non-trivial on the carbon front, because I couldn't believe this the first time I heard it, but over the lifetime of one of these deadly kerosene lanterns, that if you operate with one in your home, it's the equivalent of smoking 40 cigarettes in an evening. It's one of the highest forms of mortality for children who drink the kerosene, thinking it's lemonade or something. The fires that they create are incredible. In fact, we've had fires in 2 schools that we've been selling to. that have burnt down dormitories with pupils in them. And this is distressingly common in Africa. So all these horrible downsides that are like a microcosm of all the things that fossil fuels do on the downside, we can knock out with solar lanterns. And one of these kerosene lanterns, over its 7-year lifetime, puts a ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that we're just knocking out. Now, all of us can only operate within our spheres of influence. Solar is not a magic bullet. No single solar company, no matter how successful it could become, even if I had been able to create a Microsoft with Solar Century that I haven't been able to yet, that's not going to make a difference on its own. So we can only operate within our spheres of influence. But I hope these 2 stories will encourage people to have a go, to look at things that have a danger of working, because you're all here today because you know we're running out of time. And we need to find a whole family of stories like this, and not just in solar, but right across all the 50 or so families of clean energy. And that is where your own money, your money that has come from the bounty of oil and gas in the North Sea, in this pension fund, can be directed in ever-growing quantities going forward and become part of the solution, the road to sanity, survival, renaissance, as I call it in my new book. And I wish you all every success in making that and other successful climate campaigns work. And thank you for listening to me.